The emperor had learned through Dr. O'Meara that the governor was worried about the effect on the emperor's letter to Countess Cassis would have in England. He was busy making footnotes with comments responding to the criticisms made of him. On January 17th, 1817, the Grand Marshal came to announce to the emperor that Countess Bertrand had given birth to a boy, Arthur Bertrand. When the emperor went to see her later in the day, the countess introduced the baby to him, saying, "Sire, he is a Frenchman who entered Longwood without the governor's permission." "And a fine and healthy one at that," the emperor replied, laughing. The strict night instructions had delayed the midwife's arrival by 4 hours. The governor, whose mind seemed inclined towards conciliation, then came to find the Grand Marshal and talked to him about changes he proposed to bring about to make life more bearable for General Bonaparte on St. Helena. He even showed enough goodwill to imply he would leave him free to roam throughout the island, with certain measures other than the surveillance exercised so far. The emperor believed more in this man's duplicity than in any return to kindness toward him, and he was not mistaken. The governor wanted to precede his good intentions with a sort of memorandum justifying his acts. It purported to show that all the blame rested on Longwood and not him. The emperor rejected this justification based on the implication that if until now there had been misunderstanding between them, his entourage was to blame for this. The memorandum was tossed into the fire. Matters remained there, and the sequestration system continued to apply to Longwood. I do not believe I am mistaken in saying that since that system had been put into effect, the only foreigners the emperor had seen were Admiral and Lady Malcolm, Captain Mansell, General Bingham, 2 captains from the Newcastle, and the Eurydice, presented by the Admiral, and Mr. Balcombe and his family. All these people lived on the island, and the governor could not prevent their visits, which were rather rare. It was therefore in his own resources, and those offered by his friends, that the emperor was forced to find his distractions. The emperor always waited impatiently for the arrival of a ship from Europe. When Dr. O'Meara came to announce that the Adolphus had just dropped anchor in Jamestown Harbor, the emperor told him to go to town and bring back some news. When he returned in the afternoon, Dr. O'Meara brought back with him a small brochure written by Dr. Warden and another published by Santini. Both of these, as can be imagined, had not come through the governor's hands. The sale of the silver had caused a great commotion in England. That evening, newspapers and letters arrived. The first spoke of a long audience given by the Prince Regent to Admiral Cockburn on his arrival in London. The letters were those from the imperial family. All the members, on learning of the privations imposed on the emperor and the sale of his silver in order to meet his needs, were anxious to place the remains of their fortune at his disposal, begging him to use it as if it were his own. Madame Mère, although quite elderly, asked his permission to come and end her days close to him. Princess Pauline was not held back by her poor health and requested the same permission. The emperor could certainly expect the devotion of his family, whose glory he was, but so much heart, so much soul, so much devotion were expressed in these letters that they moved him deeply. Dr. Warden, the doctor on board the Northumberland, had had the honor of knowing the emperor during the crossing from Europe to St. Helena, and he had remained friends with Dr. O'Meara, was received by the emperor when he left the island with his ship to return to England, and received from Countess Cassis notes and information that he used to compose his brochure. He sent it to Dr. O'Meara using an address agreed on between them, so the latter could show it to the emperor. The emperor read it with interest and spoke well of it to Dr. O'Meara, but found it had been written by a man who had misheard and misunderstood what had been said to him. This pamphlet caused the emperor to dictate to Count of Montsalon a work entitled Letters About the Cape. This booklet, which attempted to refute the libel written regarding the emperor, reached France secretly and was published there. Dr. O'Meara told the emperor Dr. Warden's brochure had brought its author 50,000 francs. "That's possible," replied the emperor. "The British do not know me. Everything connected with St. Helena and published by an eyewitness and a compatriot arouses their curiosity. They are avid for details regarding me. When Balcombe offered Marchand 50 guineas for a drawing of Longwood he had just completed, he would have made a fine speculation had Marchand accepted his offer. He would have sent it to London, had it published, and gotten a lot of money from it. all of the pamphleteers agree to make a coward out of me. They shall not succeed. These are hard blows given me by the press. Never has it proved so relentless as it is in my regard. But it cannot reach me. Posterity shall do justice to such dirty writings. As for the brochure published by Santini, the emperor said, the intention is good, but it is filled with pitiful nonsense mixed with lies. Where was I ever seen shooting birds for my lunch? It is completely ridiculous. He found the manuscript from St. Helena, the work of a man of intelligence, but one who confused dates, placing Jena after the Treaty of Tilsit. Another ship coming from Europe was again to provide distraction for the emperor. There were newspapers, and I hoped also some letters. My expectations were not in vain, because there was none. As I expressed my joy to the emperor, he asked me what it said and its date. It had been written on January 8th, and I received it March 11th. My father wrote me that the King of Rome was about to be turned over to certain men. Count Dietrichstein had been named as tutor. My mother was going to leave in Vienna, and they had just bought for 42,000 francs a small property in Burgundy belonging to the former prefect of Auxerre, Monsieur de la Bergerie, who was said to have spent 100,000 francs. My father added that as soon as my mother came back to France, he intended to go shut himself up there a good part of the year. The emperor praised Monsieur de la Bergerie, saying he was a good administrator and a learned man. This piece of property, he added, must be the one belonging to the former bishop of Auxerre, along the Yonne, since you are told it is about 1 league before town. I stopped there in my youth. The house is fine, and there is much shade. I would be pleased to be there. I would have a boat so I could go out on the water. Sire, I said to him, your majesty would not remain there very long, as the current would take you to Paris. The emperor smiled at my comment, and thought that perhaps I had guessed rightly. The Grand Marshal came in to read the British newspapers to him. He said his father had written he should send his son Napoleon so he could seriously begin his education. After the emperor had returned to his apartment alone, I told him about an event that I had just occurred in St. Helena, which he would not believe until Dr. O'Meara confirmed it the following day while he was dressing. Among the men sent to work on the new house was one called Pete, a tall man and quite husky. He was specifically in charge of the wallpapering and painting. When he left London, he told his wife to come join him by the first ship leaving for the Cape. She soon did this, boarding a ship for that destination. However, along the way, she forgot the purpose of her trip. Once she arrived at the Cape, finding herself comfortable on board, she continued on to Bourbon Island with the ship's captain, who was heading there. On the ship's way back to Europe, it stopped in St. Helena. The captain came to find the husband, told him about his wife's misadventure, and made a deal with him by which, in exchange for the sum of 6,000 francs, Mrs. Pete belonged to him. The bargain having been concluded and the amount paid, a luncheon followed, attended by the wife, and, a very strange thing, I said to the emperor laughing. Heavy tears were flowing down the man's cheeks when he told me about this adventure, and he said it hurt him very much. The tears, said the emperor, were certainly the result of the wine. But how is it that the military or civil authorities had not opposed such a scandalous arrangement? The doctor replied that there existed an old English law that allowed a husband to sell his wife. This law had fallen into disuse, but had not been repealed. It was under the terms of this law that arrangement had taken place. I had advised the doctor that the emperor's legs appeared to be swollen around the ankles. The emperor showed them to him. The swelling was noticeable, and there was even a recurrence of his dysentery, although not severe. Dr. O'Meara wanted to prescribe medication, but the emperor would have none of it. He then advised exercise for his legs. But, replied the emperor, where would you have me exercise, as my executioner has taken away from me all means of doing so? From time to time, he was taken with shivering, forcing him to go to bed, that disappeared when the sweating started. His stomach pains were quite frequent, but the application of hot towels would put an end to them. The governor was aware of this, and although he knew the lack of exercise could bring about this disorder in the emperor's health, he changed nothing in the restrictions, continuing his system of sequestration, which he found not even complete enough. One man prevented him from completely surrounding Longwood, in the most profound mystery. It was Dr. O'Meara. Rumor had spread in town that the emperor was seriously ill. The commissioners themselves were worried about it and asked Sir Hudson Lowe that reports on the emperor's health be given to them. In fact, their instructions also recommended they be kept aware of the prisoner's health. Security measures could be taken, but they should not be pushed to the point of depriving him of the exercise necessary to his health. These comments from all, presented quite forcefully, even by Marquis de Montchenu, put the governor in an awkward position. He told him the news was false and that he was going to seek out its author. He came to Longwood, had himself announced to the Grand Marshal, and told him that Dr. O'Meara said in his bulletins that General Bonaparte was sick when he was not, and that this rumor had spread throughout town. Everyone is trying to deceive him, and he no longer wished to be deceived by anyone. The government had sent to the island a very good doctor, Dr. Baxter, to take care of the general. If he was ill, he had to be attended by that doctor. The Grand Marshal answered the governor firmly. He was amazed at the doubts he expressed regarding the emperor's health, as evidence of the illness was sufficiently visible in his physical appearance for the captain of the guard to notice it when he saw him, and he could have reported it to him. As for wanting to force the emperor to receive another doctor than his own, he would never consent to this, and added it was improper on his part to treat this prince as he did. The emperor approved of the Grand Marshal's words and dictated to Count de Montsalon in response to Lord Bathurst's speech a series of notes which, when brought to the governor's attention, led him to return things to approximately the same state they were in at the time of Admiral Cockburn. This communication had not yet arrived officially at Longwood, but the emperor had it through General Gourgaud, who had met General Bingham. The emperor said on this occasion, "He is a miserable pen-pusher who caves in the moment he is treated firmly." The commissioners had become alarmed about the emperor's health because General Gourgaud often encountered one of them during his rides. Not only had he told them of the emperor's deplorable health, but he added he could not understand how, in their position, they could show such indifference to what was going on at Longwood, when their presence in St. Helena was less to see to his detention than to verify that he was treated properly. The emperor had cured himself from this indisposition with the same regimen that had cured him before, keeping to his room, fasting, and chicken broth. He thus told General Gourgaud, who had been hit a second time by a rather severe attack of dysentery, "Do not let them drug you. Those Britishers have medications that are suited to horses, but they irritate more than they relieve." And as if chicken broth were the universal remedy, he recommended it to him. The general did not follow the emperor's advice, as his symptoms required rapid and efficient remedies. They were administered to him, and he got better. 8 to 10 days later, his convalescence began, and he resumed his usual life, however, with a great intestinal weakness. On April 10th, the China fleet arrived in St. Helena. It was a time of festivities for the island inhabitants. They were able to purchase objects they needed and sell their goods or vegetables to the ships in the harbor at a very high price. During this short time, the crews, the officers, and the passengers left much money in town and gave Jamestown an unusual degree of activity. Aboard one of these ships was a present sent to the emperor that could be called a debt of gratitude. Mr. Mannering, a distinguished scholar who was traveling for research in the arts and humanities, had been asked to give it to him when passing through St. Helena. A letter accompanied the present from the Honorable Mr. Elphinstone, who was thankful to the person who, on the eve of the Battle of Waterloo, had brought assistance to his seriously wounded brother on the battlefield. The present consisted of a magnificent ivory chess set larger than the usual size, 2 large and beautiful open-work baskets, and an exquisite ivory basket filled with mother-of-pearl tokens. All of it was remarkably executed. On each piece was a crowned eagle, and the letter N capped it with an imperial crown. When he arrived in St. Helena, Mr. Mannering followed the instructions prescribed for foreigners who came to town. He handed Mr. Elphinstone's present over to the governor, so as to have it sent on to Longwood. The governor did not know what to do with this object sent to the prisoner of St. Helena. It had not reached him through the usual channels, and carried an imperial symbol his government did not wish to recognize. He hesitated between handing it over or sending it to Europe so that it would come back to St. Helena. However, realizing he would appear ridiculous in the eyes of his ministers, he sent along the crates containing the objects more than a month after they arrived. The act of humanity that had earned the emperor this present was quite common with him. He never went through a battlefield without having his own sergeant care for friends or enemies who still seemed to be alive, and the silver wine flask carried by Rustam or Saint-Denis for his own personal use was often used to give strength to those who were exhausted. Mr. Elphinstone's brother, severely wounded the day before Waterloo, was in an almost desperate state when the emperor, going by him, sent his surgeon to take care of him as needed. The emperor decided to give the presents to Empress Marie-Louise and the King of Rome. Countess de Montsalon, when she left St. Helena, was to deliver them upon arriving in Europe. At the same time, a ship arrived from England, the Bering. A gunnery chief had taken it upon himself on his arrival in St. Helena to deliver to the emperor a marble bust of the King of Rome, the work of a sculptor in Livorno, who had added a letter to his shipment. The emperor was immediately informed of this when the ship arrived, but 8 days later the bust had not yet been sent. The governor's predicament was awkward, but his chief of staff, Sir Thomas Reed, had simply suggested tossing it into the sea to solve the problem. The statement was denied, but how could one not believe it when, on a previous occasion, the same high-ranking officer had said when speaking to the emperor, "If I were governor, I would teach that French cur a thing or two. I would isolate him from his friends, who are worth no more than he, and then I would take away his books. He is nothing but a miserable outlaw. I would treat him as such, and by God, it would be doing the King of France a great favor to get rid of him." That fit of temper from Sir Thomas Reed had been provoked by the emperor's refusal to receive Sir Thomas Strange, one of the superior judges in Calcutta, who had, through the governor, requested the honor of being presented to him. The emperor had sent this reply: "People who have descended into the grave do not receive visits. Bertrand, make sure this judge hears my reply. Was it not strange that as the emperor had declared he would receive no visitors unless presented by Count Bertrand, the governor still brought him one? Hudson Lowe's anger was great, but that of his chief of staff exceeded all limits. The governor put an end to his hesitations, came to see the Grand Marshal, and told him that a marble bust of General Bonaparte's son had been brought on the Bering, and that it was a mediocre piece by a Livorno sculptor. On his cover letter, the sculptor admitted having been paid, but recommended himself to the generosity of General Bonaparte. The whole affair struck the governor as a speculation, and the cost of 100 louis, 2,000 francs, that the artist assigned to the expected commission was an exorbitant and unacceptable claim. The Grand Marshal replied that the emperor alone could decide that matter, and that seeing the features of his son, which had been deprived him of so many years, was priceless. He therefore urged the governor to send it to him that same day. The following day it arrived at Longwood. The white marble bust was quite well made, and the inscription said, Napoleon, Francois, Charles Joseph, and it was decorated with the great cross of the Legion of Honor. When the emperor received it, he remained in contemplation of this picture of his son. "How can it be," he said, "that on this rock there is a man savage enough to order this bust thrown into the ocean? He is certainly not a father. For me this bust is worth more than millions. Put it on the table in the drawing room so that I may see it every day." The following letter was written by the Grand Marshal to the gunnery chief on the Bering. "I have received the marble bust of young Napoleon. I have given it to his father, and it gave him the greatest satisfaction. I regret it was not possible for you to come visit us and give us the details which, for a father in his position, would have been the greatest interest. From the letters you have sent me, it appears that the artist assigns the value of 100 pounds to his work. The emperor has ordered me to give you a letter of credit for 300 pounds. The excess amount is intended to indemnify you the losses he knows you have suffered on the sale of your merchandise, as you were not able to unload it, and for the prejudice this event has caused you, but which will entitle you to the esteem of any honorable man. Please be kind enough to convey to the people who had this kind thought all the emperor's thanks. I remain, etc., Count Bertrand." The delay in sending these objects had irritated the emperor over what he called the governor's duplicity and ill will. He had Count Bertrand write the following letter: "Governor, I have received the 5 crates you took the trouble to send me, containing a chess set, a box of tokens, and 2 ivory baskets sent from Canton by Mr. Elphinstone. The emperor was surprised to see in your letter that you believed it your duty not to hand over these objects. You say if I acted in full compliance with the established regulations, I should suspend any forwarding. In this case, Governor, you would have done the appropriate thing by holding them back. But to what does this apply? Did these objects not arrive through the channels of the ministry? In the ministry restrictions, it is specified that letters must come through its channels, but not objects of apparel, busts, furniture, etc. We have constantly received many objects sent to us from the Cape. In fact, Lord Bathurst, in his speech, and you yourself in letters, have always indignantly rejected the accusation that letters coming by the post or other means had been sent to London to come back to this country. This cannot and could not have authorized you to hold back objects such as busts, furniture, books, and any other effects having no relation whatsoever to the security of the detention. Would it be because there is a crown on the tokens? But there can exist no regulation that is not brought to our attention, and there is, to our knowledge, nothing to prevent us from owning an object bearing a crown. Is that case, it would also be necessary to manufacture new decks of cards, because there are crowns on the ones provided. The linen and the little silver still remaining often go to town, and they are marked with a crown. From whom could come this ruling that you say is in force? From your government, which alone has the right to issue same? In accordance with the bill, your ministry has declared in open parliament that it had made no restriction, only that of taking measures of execution. In effect, you have no right to do so. The emperor wants no favor from anyone and wishes to owe nothing to anyone's whims. But he has the right to know the restrictions imposed on him. Your government, the parliament, and all nations have the same right. I therefore beg you, sir, to communicate to us these new restrictions. If there were such restrictions, they would be in contradiction with Lord Bathurst's assertions that they may have no other goal but ensuring the security of the detention. The emperor asks me to protest against the existence of any restriction or rule that has not been legally communicated to him prior to its execution. I remain etc. Count Bertrand. The governor's response to this letter was not long in coming. Sir, I have received your letter of the 9th. Your frequent use of the title of emperor therein and the tone in which you express your sentiments to me when employing it would give me sufficient justification for remaining silent on its contents as being addressed to me in inadmissible form, and for referring you to my letter of August 30th, 1816 to Count de Montsalon. However, I will not avail myself of this reason for refusing to reply to it. My only goal in writing to you on the 8th of this month was to prevent the impression that I had tacitly recognized or approved the use of the imperial rank in the crown placed everywhere over the initial of Napoleon, found on the gifts sent by a private British subject and coming from a British factory. If I had let them pass without comment, the conclusion would necessarily have been drawn that I saw nothing inappropriate in this. I do not know to what point this precedent could have been claimed and what complaints could have arisen had it been deviated from in the future. Had I not explicitly stated my reasons in this case for allowing the objects in question to reach you. The person who made these gifts has his own opinions, but I also have the right to exercise my judgment and not allowing them to be expressed by my intermediary in letting the presents be delivered without other commentary than that in my letter. I went to the extreme limits of what could be exacted of me regarding General Bonaparte's wishes and expectations. You ask me, sir, is it because these objects did not arrive through the channels of the ministry? I would have considered myself fully justified in holding them back according to the general nature of my instructions, even without the decoration found on them, until I had obtained my government's express permission to deliver them, had I not made use of my discretionary power to examine them and satisfy myself they did not conceal a means of communication that could lead to a clandestine correspondence. My having sent you the letter even before the objects were debarked is sufficient proof that this was the principle I adhered to rather than awaiting instructions from England. You note, sir, that I indignantly rejected the accusation that letters arriving through the post or by private means were returned to London to be sent again to this country. I most certainly rejected this accusation, sir, as well as the accusations to which it gave rise, because they contained no truth or justice, because I was outraged. at this sentiment that finds humiliation and cause for blame in expressions of attention, because in sending family letters, I had exercised on behalf of the persons who appealed to me a discretionary power not authorized by my instructions. But I do not admit that I did not have the right and would not have been perfectly justified in returning letters to England if I found it appropriate, when they arrived by unconventional channels. Presents as well as a letter may threaten the security of the detention and may be subject to an examination that would prevent their ever being used as objects of decoration or utility. A letter can be hidden under the squares of a chessboard or in the cover of a book, as well as in the lining of a waistcoat, and I am under no obligation to trust the person sending them, whoever it may be. If I permitted the objects to be delivered to you, it was because I was convinced they were not of an objectionable nature. And you certainly have no reason, sir, to complain of the manner in which I used my discretionary authority, as much in generally consenting to the delivery of every object that arrives, as in allowing to pass other objects addressed to me whose senders left the delivery entirely up to my judgment. You observe, sir, it is because there is a crown on the tokens, and you ask whether there exists a regulation forbidding you to possess an object with a crown on it. There is certainly no explicit written regulation which forbids any object decorated with a crown being delivered to Longwood, or which forbids you to own any such thing. But in this case, it is a question of the imperial crown over the initial of Napoleon, carved, gilded, engraved, and present on almost every object. His abdication, the Treaty of Paris, and the acts of the British Parliament make such a regulation unnecessary. The objects decorated with the imperial crown that are currently found at Longwood carried his mark prior to the abdication. I have never disputed your possessions of them or any satisfaction they may bring you. As for the passage where you cite parliamentary debates, allow me to inform you that this is incorrect according to the newspapers I have seen. The newspapers themselves are not in agreement, as one speaks of regulations and another of instructions, not restrictions, as being the same without any substantial alteration to those initially stipulated. You say, sir, you do not have the right. The Act of Parliament, the Commission, and the instructions provided to me are, sir, my surest guides in this respect. However, allow me to add that my initial instructions, which you claim to be my only guidelines, have received a wider interpretation than what their strict and literal sense would apply, relative to the degree of personal inconvenience General Bonaparte now suffers. You add, the Emperor wishes no favors. I do not claim the power to do General Bonaparte a favor, much less the arrogance of subjecting him to an act of my whim. He is under no restriction my government is not aware of, and which the entire world cannot know. I will take this occasion to remind you that General Bonaparte himself, in the 2 conversations I have had with him, noted to me that as a general officer, I had to act in accordance with my instructions and do my duty as in order I was to fulfill. On another occasion, he refused to allow any direct or public inspection. How can these constraints be reconciled within the narrow limits within which you now seek to restrain the exercise of my duty? The opinions you have presented to me coincide with my own, seeing that all exercise of my discretionary power, even in the case where I try to act the most favorably, only engenders new arguments. But when such opposite sentiments are expressed to me, you will recognize, sir, the difficulty of reconciling them. You say, sir, the Emperor has asked me to protest against the existence of all restrictions. It is essential to my duty, each time that circumstances allow, to take into consideration all communications made to me on behalf of the person you so designate. However, it would be impossible to give official notification of a measure arising from a particular circumstance before that circumstances has been brought about by its necessity. The measure of which you speak was not of a nature to be communicated in advance, but it was certainly not put into effect before you had been given knowledge of it. I remain, ETC, Hudson Lowe, Lieutenant General.